Hey everyone! So this is an informative video about teaching in culturally diverse classrooms. So, I'm not sure if you've heard or noticed, but Australia is pretty multicultural. In fact, we are probably considered one of the most idyllic multicultural nations. The 2011 census conducted by the Australian Bureau of Statistics found that about a quarter of us are born overseas and 43% have migrant parents. In the years 2011 and 2012, about 200,000 new migrants and refugees settled in Australia. That's a lot of people. To put things into perspective, if Australia was a class of 50 children, 17 would be from the United Kingdom, 7 would be Chinese, 5 Indian, 5 New Zealand, 4 Filipino, 3 South African, 2 Vietnamese, 2 Malaysian, 1 South Korean, and 1 from Sri Lanka. The remaining students would be Australian born. That means, statistically, you are more likely to be teaching a multicultural classroom than a monocultural one.
If we go back in time, Australian history is littered with incidences of racism, right from the get-go with British colonisation in 1877, during the Gold Rush era with an influx of European and Asian migrants, and within Australian politics, the White Australia policy. Australia's racial crimes from the past continually influence the perspectives of the generations following, and have them reproduce their own forms of discrimination to the extent that racism has embedded itself almost as an accepted or expected aspect of daily life, with no real strides being taken towards addressing its eradication. The leaders of our nation, adults and media perpetuate this trend, so it's no surprise that these attitudes are also mirrored in our schools.
As educators, however, we not only have the obligation to, but the ability to change and shape the perspectives that students have of each other to combat racism. The aim is to have students recognize and respect the cultural differences of their peers as something valued and special to them in the very same way they too value their own culture. Every student is brought up differently and raised with differing values and beliefs, which not only impact on their perspectives and attitudes, but also the way they approach their schooling. As such, they also have their own unique stories, a direct reflection of their identities. It's important to distill negative environments of discrimination and racism in the classroom, as it allows students to be proud of who they are. This can be done through open discussions and building positive student-teacher relations as a means to recognize students as a whole person, outside of school.
What so many teachers seem to misunderstand is the fact that we don't need to be explicit in tackling these issues of racism and identity, but rather we're able to address these issues just by engaging with the students' funds of knowledge, pools of interests and experiences. We just need to be genuine with them, and of course some people might counter to that and say,
"Oh, well that's a bit personal, don't you think? Not everyone is going to be comfortable sharing their stories."
To that we ask, why do you think that is? It's because they're scared. And why are they scared? Because they're taught to think that being different is somehow wrong. The first step is to create an environment where we teach them, despite what society may preach, that it is okay for them to be different, where it's safe for them to share their experiences and interests. It benefits the learning of the students by enabling them to share and incorporate themselves into the classroom, thereby increasing the relevance of each subject they learn. More importantly, what we are doing is enabling them with the skills to function within society on a global scale.
We can't just avoid it just because it's a sensitive or troublesome issue to incorporate into the classroom. To ignore this is also ignoring the potential change we can make in society, however little or large. An easy way to start in the classroom is to perhaps take the first steps ourselves and show our students that we're people too. We have a story that we're proud of, and they should be proud of theirs as well.
And that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. My parents were both born in South Vietnam. My father came from a family of 6 and my mother from a family of 4. They both studied as medicine technicians, my father in Vĩnh Long and my mother in Saigon University. Though it was the same degree, my mum practiced medicine in a hospital, while my father was an active member of the medical corps, tending to the people injured during the war. Though after the country fell under the communist regime, my parents lost their jobs. My father worked in a farm for a few years, while my mother looked after my 2 oldest brothers full-time. When my father could, he found a way out of Vietnam under the sponsorship of the US Navy in the early 80s. They sent him to a small Japanese island called Okinawa, while my mother and brothers stayed in Vietnam and waited for him. He lived at a refugee camp for a couple of years while learning the basics of Japanese and worked doing little jobs fixing what he could as a trained electrician and handyman. After some paperwork, my father flew over to Australia and started work in 2 different clothing factories to prepare for the arrival of my mum and brothers, and by the time I was born, we were a family of 6. For the majority of my childhood, my parents worked from home sewing clothes to support my brothers and me. They retired around the time I graduated from high school, as my older brothers found work to support the family instead. I didn't have a childhood of luxury, but at the same time it wasn't the worst either. I didn't actually realize until I was a senior in high school that for most of my life, my family didn't necessarily make the most money. But the way my parents raised me with their work ethic and values, I was genuinely grateful for what I did have growing up. A lot of what my parents taught me, and a lot of who I am as a Vietnamese Australian, influenced a lot of my high school career. But none of my teachers ever encouraged for the incorporation of my interests in knowledge. All but one, my Year 8 English teacher. She believed in my ability and gave me the advice to write about what you know and what you like best. After that year she left, but I took on board what she told me and engaged with my own education to make it work for myself. Being around my father's handy side and my mum's ability to sew translated into my deep interest in designing and creating things in wood technology. I found it easier to empathize with the Vietnam War unit taught in history as well, for obvious reasons. And perhaps the best example I can give is for the HSC English, while deconstructing a poem which was about a refugee child and his father. Basically, the child watched his father taking pleasure and finding sanctuary in their garden at home, but the child couldn't understand why. This is something I could understand, because it was more or less the exact same situation regarding myself and my own parents. After they migrated to Australia, they also found sanctuary in our garden, and I understood why. I understood the pride and care a person has in gardening where someone else doesn't, like the child in the poem. And I was able to do well in that unit.
Yeah, I remember studying that poem too. Peter Shinescu, right? I have a home garden as well. My grandpa was actually the first person in his village to ever attend university, and he chose to study agriculture as a major. He even has a documentary where he went to the mountains and helped people there learn to have sustainable farming practices. He handed down these skills to my mum, and so we grow a whole variety of vegetables in our backyard and save money on the groceries. The knowledge my grandparents and parents had was something I didn't appreciate until I was much older. Growing up, particularly when I was young, I was quite embarrassed by my culture. I used to be bullied by other students for having small eyes, speaking funny, and eating different things. To make matters worse, it wasn't even the Australian-born students teasing me. It was another minority cultural group. And so, in my primary school years, I really tried to separate myself from being Chinese, because it was the one thing that made me different. Now I only have the capacity to speak Chinese like an 8-year-old. You know, the basics like, I'm hungry, I'm sleepy, can I borrow some money please? Although I still participate in cultural celebrations like Chinese New Year and Moon Festival. In hindsight, my culture and my upbringing have taught me a lot, particularly in terms of how I see education. My dad and millions of other Chinese children were not allowed to attend school or even study for several years under the rule of Mao Zedong, even though all those internet websites and Wikipedia pages praise him for improving China's education. During these times of hardship, many died from starvation. I still hear stories of how people had to eat tree bark for survival, or have lost contact with all 12 of their siblings during the war like my grandma has. When my parents came to Australia for a better life, they had less than a few $100s. They worked odd jobs that paid next to nothing to support me and my brother. My dad always encouraged me to try my best to succeed in school, and so along with his encouragement and these stories of adversity, I don't think I've ever taken my education for granted, even though I was educated entirely through the public education system, which is basically free. These are merely snippets of our migrant stories, but look at all the things we know and understand that just isn't acknowledged in the classroom. It's just assumed that what we know is only what we have learnt from school, which is simply not the case. We are the students who once sat in your classrooms, and you will have many students just like us. Are we really expected to leave what we know from our parents, grandparents' culture and upbringing at home, and to see teachers as our only source of knowledge?
I'm pretty sure your answer would be no. Now, it seems logical to open up conversations in the classroom to what kind of funds of knowledge your students have, but it takes on average 1 to 2 years to pick up playground language and about another 5 to 7 years to get an average score in English tests. For a recent migrant, do you think these students will be willing, comfortable, even confident enough to speak to a whole classroom of students? Think pair share discussion activities is a way to get these students talking. Such a teaching strategy gives your students an opportunity to speak and interact with the English language, but in an environment that is less threatening. Rather than making the entire classroom the stage for them to share their experiences, have them do it on a smaller scale first with well-designed and managed think-pair sharing activities. It has the potential to be that platform for students to share those more personal ideas with each other. Then to develop the strategy further, you might have students pair up with several partners throughout one lesson so that they've engaged with a variety of ideas and views. This can also lead up to a summative discussion in which students can share the ideas of others anonymously, contributing to creating a safe environment, giving students the confidence and access to participating in learning activities.
Additionally, to tap into these funds of knowledge, we need to foster and build positive and fair relationships between students and teachers, among students, and between schools and communities, overall to promote understanding, celebration, and normalization of diversity. In this way, we can prevent bullying, like I have experienced, and further value students as learners by making their learning meaningful and engaging in a safe and supportive environment, while providing quality content to meet curriculum outcomes.
We know it probably seems daunting, and of course it's a fine balancing act not to treat students of different cultures as all the same, or the complete opposite as these exotic creatures. But I'm sure you chose to be a teacher because you wanted to make a difference. Not only is it a legal responsibility, but also a moral obligation to acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of cultures within the classroom, and to use it in a way to access and build upon deeper knowledge and understanding of the classroom learning materials. These principles are also reflected and outlined in a number of policies, including the anti-bullying policy, anti-racism policy, and multicultural education policy. They advocate for increased understanding and appreciation of each other's cultures to reduce and prevent racism. Furthermore, however, we believe that the concept of providing access and opportunities to learn for all students in any circumstance should be equally valued as socially just educators.
Let's plant the seeds to let them grow, to provide our students with the opportunity to explore different ways of thinking, and not just what to think, but how to think critically about issues in society. Thanks for listening. Bye!
See ya.